So the first thing I had to learn uh, in becoming a historian was whether or not these, what might consider to be trivial differences for most people, important enough for me to be interested in. And to my surprise, I was interested. And I thought it was enjoyable trying to figure out what happened and what happened first and what happened second. And so doing that type of work didn't bother me. So that was really a first step, which the type of work which is looking at documents, looking at materials very carefully and recording the details as best you can and putting them together like a puzzle. So that methodologically is the most important thing to be able to do, is to be able to deal with those details. But you also have to have questions. And what do you want to know? I mean, the past is obviously gigantic. And what do you want to know when you can't know everything and you have to focus on something? And the way I started out was a learning process. As an undergraduate, I only had one or two history courses. I didn't have a history major. So I went into graduate school at a great disadvantage to other graduate students because I had not had much history. And so the first shock to me was when I was in my first graduate seminar is how much more everybody else knew than I did. And that I really didn't know much about a lot of things that I was supposedly now studying in great detail. And here I was with other people who had 3, 4, 5 courses in the exact narrow area that what I thought was a narrow area at the time and then at the time it was American history. I was interested in American history. I was interested in American foreign policy in particular, because it was a time when it had become apparent to me that the United States was a disruptive force in the world. And being an American, I didn't like that. And I wanted to know more about what happened and how it happened and why everybody accepted policies that to me seemed to be confrontational and not in the interests of a peaceful world. So that was my focus, that was my interest, and on that side I was much more developed than I was as a history student. I'd done a lot more political thinking than I had actually done real history work. So when I was in my first seminar, it was very sobering because everybody else in the seminar, oh, they knew the names of every single president of the United States, the dates, they knew da da da. They had all this. They were like walking encyclopedias as far as I was concerned, and I didn't know very much about any of this, and so I was really very, very, very far behind. And the only way I really coped in that first year was, for some reason, I somehow convinced the professor that I was working with that I wanted to look at the coast of New England in the period from about 1790 to 1810 and figure out how many lighthouses there were and where they were and when they had been built. Isn't that pretty crazy? I thought that was pretty crazy, but I always liked lighthouses because that's where I grew up. I had a lot of lighthouses around me. So I found a question that had nothing to do with imperialism or US this or US that. And I found that I was really interested in recording all of this quite trivial data about lighthouses, and then I even expanded into foghorns and other navigational devices that were being developed basically by the government. And then my only problem was, because this is the next thing you learn in history, is you have to have a theory. You have to have something you're trying to do, prove whatever. So here I did all this research without any theory, without any idea, and I had to do it backwards and come up with a theory by the end of this paper on lighthouses. And I did in the end, because I, in the end, argued that this was the end of the mercantile period in U.S. history in which the government actively intervened in the economy to support the economy and to make sure that one's own citizens had beneficial results as opposed to every other country. And so the government, in effect, was investing in lighthouses to promote shipping and to promote fishing, and therefore was developing the economy. So this was my theory that I finally latched onto after I actually did the research. And that was all. That was cool. So I enjoyed that. Unfortunately, I have no idea where that paper is anymore, or we'd have a very good history. And I never published my history of lighthouses. And I'm sure that it would have been published in the Journal of New England Trivia or something, somewhere. Anyway, they would have loved it. So that was the second thing, was to come up with some theory, some ideas. And that put me even further behind, because I realized that these other people who had gone to, really elite schools in the United States, like Swarthmore and so on, as undergraduates, and here they were now sitting, and in fact, the guy who shocked me the most was a student by the name of Mark Agnall, who turned out got a job at York University a year before I did. And so we were colleagues. Not only we had been in an original seminar together, but we were colleagues throughout our career. And he retired a number of years ago. He's still around. But he was the one that scared me the most, because he seemed to know the most. And this was exactly that initial seminar when I was studying lighthouses was exactly the focus of his PhD, not the lighthouses, but that period was the focus of his PhD research. So he was light years ahead of me, because I was about to shift to African history. I didn't have a topic, let alone be so disciplined and so focused as I thought all of the other students were. Of course, not all the other students were that focused, but I was at sort of one extreme, because I had started in electrical engineering, not in history. I hadn't taken a history course. I'd only become interested in it. So somehow I got through that first year, realizing that I was on a very steep upward learning curve, which I enjoyed. It was one in which I needed help, which I got from my peers, from other graduate students who were extremely generous and extremely kind, and didn't laugh at me too much because of my idiocy and ignorance, which I gradually overcame. But the problem is that then I started to work on my master's thesis, and that got me into the next problem, because with the advice of my supervisor, I ended up working on a project that was on Central America. I'm still very far from Africa, as you can see. And I started working on a project on Central America, and it was on American imperialism in Central America in the 19th century. and the early attempts to build a canal, this was pre-Panama Canal. When they built the Panama Canal and finished it in 1903, that was the end, and that was that had been the aim for more than 50 years, was to find a way to build a canal across Central America. And so I studied that for my MA, which I also never published, although I think it's in some ways what I did is publishable. There's no question in my mind that it is actually. But the problem when I got into working and doing this work on U.S. intervention and plans and economic development and spread of banana cultivation, pineapple cultivation, and the fruit companies really becoming the lead for U.S. imperialism in Central America. I learned all about that, and it was all very fascinating, and I could, see how people were sometimes they were always very imperialist. They always had very what I would call a typical American attitude, that the only people who know how to do anything are Americans and everybody else are idiots. And this was all evident through everything. There was all the discussion in the paper. Why are we just negotiating with these governments? Why don't we just take them over? And why don't we just invade? This was the rhetoric behind. We want more slave states. We want more. This was the rhetoric, and I was very interested in that because I was very opposed to it, and so that was all very interesting. But I didn't understand is I didn't understand anything about Central America. Zero. When I started, I didn't even know the names of the capitals of the country. Tegucigalpa. Where's Tegucigalpa? Who knows? Which country is that connected with? Well, that was me, that sort of level of ignorance. And then the other thing that was hard was I couldn't understand any of the political interaction between the United States and these Central American countries. I couldn't understand because all the time, I did understand that there were two political factions, basically, in Central America, no matter which country it was, and they were conveniently called conservatives and liberals, which sounded nice, except the trouble was that the conservatives in one country were the liberals in the next country, and so you never really knew what the issues were. You never really, I didn't know what the issues, I didn't know what they were talking about. I didn't understand the history. I didn't understand, why aren't all these countries united? And it's, why this, why that? I had all these questions. None of them came through in any of the research that was going on. Moreover, the other thing that came through that didn't come through in me is I realized there were a lot of indigenous people in Central America. More so in Guatemala than in Costa Rica, but nonetheless a lot, right through the whole area. And in all of the work I was doing, there's no mention about indigenous people. There's nothing about any policy in relation to indigenous people. There's nothing about who's going to grow the bananas. Well, it sure ain't going to be the indigenous people because they brought in people from the Caribbean islands to do that. And so I'm suddenly scratching my head. Look, like there's a sizable population, in some places approaching 50% of the population that's indigenous. We don't even talk about it. What's going on here? So the problem was I had no idea what was going on. The other thing that wasn't talked about at all was black people. Even though they were the laborers who were growing the bananas, and they were the ones building the railroads and the canals, or trying to, no discussion. no relationship to what was going on in the Caribbean. So that left me even more ignorant. So on the one hand, the topic was interesting. On the other hand, all it exposed was a new level of ignorance that I couldn't quite fathom. So that got me into a real difficult situation, and I switched. I got out of American history, and I actually switched into Latin American history, which created a new problem because the dynamic individuals who were at Wisconsin when I was there were in African history, not in Latin American history. And once I found that out, well, I had no real commitment to Latin America. At this point, I did not want to study U.S. history anymore. I got to the point in my development where I didn't care about U.S. imperialism. I mean, I did in a political sense, but I didn't care in an intellectual sense. I was more interested in what was going on in the countries where the United States was intervening and doing this stuff. That's what I wanted to know what was going on, what was going on in these different countries. And so I shifted to Africa because of one of the professor who actually became my supervisor, Philip Curtin, who's an extremely distinguished historian. He's now no longer with us, but he's left a legacy as a teacher and as a mentor that has been very important to many people, including myself. And it happened that while I was taking his course, I discovered I really didn't like the professors that were teaching Latin American history, which, to tell you the truth, was very presumptuous on my part. You know, who says a student has the right to like or not like the professor? The point is to learn, not to like or dislike. But anyway, I went after the ones that I liked, and they turned out to be unbelievable, brilliant historians, very successful, published lots and lots and lots, and have had lots of students, and gave me a network, put me into a network that I'm still part of. And and it was different because the level of the dynamic interest and the way that professors were teaching was exciting. And in terms of methodology, that puts me into another whole category because the emphasis at the time when I was in graduate school was on collecting oral data. It was, in fact, Jan Vansina, my other professor, these were my two professors. Jan Vansina was, and still is in many ways, the foremost authority on the collection and analysis of oral traditions. And he's actually written one book in which is entirely based on oral tradition, is not based on any written sources, and is based on linguistic analysis, based on all kinds of stuff, that anthropological field work by living in an area and all kinds of, and the collections of stories and collecting songs and collecting all kinds of information and putting it together as history. And so the big emphasis was for all of us was we were all, I think, convinced in the late 1960s, early 1970s, that the amount of historical documentation on Africa was very limited and not much work had been done. A lot of it was very superficial. A lot of it was very Eurocentric, by which I mean, in this case, it was really the study of Europeans in Africa rather than the study of Africans in Africa. And so I was part of a group under the influence of these two professors, Curtin and Vansina, um, that we focused on pre-colonial, which meant fewer and fewer European sources. And our job was, in effect, we were taught, at least I got the message, was I'm going to go out and collect oral traditions. I'm going to go out and collect oral data. I'm going to go out and find out, I'm going to live there like an anthropologist, and I'm going to collect information, which means you have to learn language, which means you have to have enough money so you can go and live there. As a student at that time, you didn't need much money actually to live there. It was sometimes pretty rough, but nonetheless, that was the nature of the late 1960s, early 70s. That was how things were in Africa. They were pretty rough. And but I didn't mind that. I enjoyed camping anyway, and so this was like camping in a certain kind of way. And so I ended up selecting a topic that specifically and deliberately was not intended to have a lot of European sources. And it was to study trade and commerce within West Africa in the periods from about 1700 to 1900, and which is what I did. And I studied one caravan route basically, and how it operated, and who made money off of it, and what did they do with the money, and who were the merchants, and where they lived, and I interviewed a lot of people that were involved in that particular trade, and made an important historical discovery that that the merchants were really divided into three groups. They were all related within themselves, but they were really three groups of merchants that dominated this caravan trade. And I say groups of merchants because they really weren't a kinship network, because you really couldn't piece together the genealogies in a way that could show how everybody among the three groups, within each of the three groups, that they were all related. But they were. They weren't related necessarily by blood, but they were related by what it turned out, and this was the discovery for me, was in the Hausa language, they were related by what Hausa referred to as asili, which roughly translated means origins. And so they're all really basing their connection on the basis of their origins. And there was a kinship factor in that each of the three groups practiced endogamy in terms of marriage. That is, they only married within their group. They didn't marry outside, and you don't really know, but you do get the sense of the corporate, the association within the group, which of course turned out to be very important because all trade operates on credit. You need money, you need cash, but you have to have a level of trust. And this is how these groups operated. They trusted themselves and no one else. And the reason they married within, they didn't want their money to go into anybody else's pockets. They wanted the money to stay within the group. So that's why. So whenever anybody broke the hidden taboo about who you could marry or not, they would find a way of, criticizing and making sure the marriage didn't work, in effect. And So I had to learn a lot about marriage customs and marriage practices and what was going on in an extremely different society, a Muslim society, in which in the time that I was studying, it would not have been unusual for a girl of uh, any girl who's passed through puberty is a woman. And anybody who's passed through puberty is a woman. That means I can get married. And it doesn't. We're not talking about age. We're talking about puberty. We're talking nothing more than that. And very often, by the time a girl gets to the age of 19, she could be married 2 or 3 times. She, and because it was then and even now, it's in this Muslim society, it's very easy to get divorced. A man just has to publicly denounce his wife, and that's it. That's it. The marriage is over. The woman doesn't have quite that flexibility. She really has to go to court, but because she's a woman, she's not allowed in the court. She has to stand outside and talk through an interpreter through a window. Okay, and usually what the judge will say, okay, I hear you. So he beat you up. I hear you. I'll give you 1 week. You go back. You work it out within 1 week. If you can't work it out in a week, come back. And then 1 week she comes back and says, no, he beat me up again. Says, all right, you're divorced. So it was harder for the woman, but not that hard. So that in the course of a female's life from a respectable family who might very well be married when she's in her early teens the first time. By the time she's a grandmother, she could have been married 3-4 times. And keeping extended families and keeping relationships, and all of which is governed by custom and common sense, actually. When the problem when a man and a woman get divorced is that technically the children stay with the father. They're his children, not her children, because a man can have more than one wife, and all of those children are his children. And so if you get divorced, well, it doesn't mean that the children break off with their mother. They certainly do not. But they retain the link with the father. So what you end up with, of course, and this is where these groups of merchants worked so well in that form, is you end up with very extended families that are very loosely knit together, where adoption and mentoring are extremely common. For example, in a normal situation among these merchants that I was studying, that I focused in on, a son didn't learn the business of the trade from his father. No, he learned it from his uncle. And usually what happened is that the boys at a certain point, about 8 or 9, they wouldn't live with their father and mother anymore. They would go and live with an uncle or another relative who would teach them the business. So this extension of the family and these linkages in terms of training, in terms of education, in terms of there were no such at the time. There were no such thing as orphans. There were no orphans. There's always someone looking after that kid, and that kid is integrated into a family, very big families, big households. Lots of women, fewer men, because it's a Muslim society and that's the way the structure is. But so that's what I ended up sort of studying, and then things The methodology was based on getting to know people, and in my very limited, crude Hausa fluency, to um, convince people they should tell me things that were not just obvious, trivial things. Now, give you an example of the problem. Because they knew, obviously, because I'm white and because I'm a foreigner, they knew I was white and a foreigner. And so if I ask a question, very often people would answer considering that I know nothing. It's as if somebody came to us here in Ontario from outside of Ontario and wanted to know some details about Toronto. Well, you start by giving really superficial, oh, you got to go to the islands. Oh, you do things until you can't get into, well, what is the history of those islands? How many people in Toronto know about history? No. That's when you have to get into people who really know the local. And that's, of course, the level that I wanted to get into. But very often in starting off interviews, oh, I'm studying this trade. Oh, well, let me tell you about this trade. What we did was, and then I'd get the same story from everybody about, oh, the caravans were about 1,000, 1,500 donkeys. We had a long, you had to go in a long line. There was a person who was up front. He was the one who was the caravan guide who knew where we were going. And then the caravan leader, who was in charge of the whole caravan, he was at the very end, at the back end of the caravan, not at the front, because he had to be there because if there are any stragglers or problems, he had to be in a position where he could deal with it. And of course, the guy up front, he had to be on the lookout for bandits because there were so many people and so many livestock, and it was so easy to infiltrate and steal things. And so I had to be, I had to learn all of this. So on the one level, but I wanted to know, who were the major caravan leaders? Tell me about them. Give me their names. Then I started getting into really interesting stuff. And it was only then that I really discovered that there were three separate, or actually, three separate groups of merchants that worked together, but they didn't intermarry. And things became more and more complicated as once I made that breakthrough. And one of the areas where I made that breakthrough was on facial scarification, because each of the three groups had a different scarification for their face. And it wasn't ethnic, but everybody knew who everybody was just by looking at their face. I could tell, oh, I see her marks, I can marry her. See her marks? Nope. It was just amazing. This type of social engineering that has been developed by a society that enables peaceful coexistence. And it isn't that different groups didn't marry outside of their own group. They did, because groups had what they called joking relationships with other groups. So, for example, two groups might be separate, but they would have a joking relationship, which meant that you saw someone, you know who they were from another group, but you could make silly jokes and do this, that, and hang out and do all this, and this was fine. If you had that type of relationship, you could marry across. You see, if you didn't have that relationship, you shouldn't. And of course, Muslims and Christians didn't marry. Different, real barriers. And so that was what I was learning. And the methodology was on how to do interviewing, how to record the interviews, how to ask. I had to learn methodologically. I had to learn as I said, I often got answers that were trivial, as if I was just a tourist that had come in for a weekend and needed to know trivial, basic stuff, nothing more. So I discovered that even though I had been taught how to interview and how to be neutral and not to show any specific orientation, didn't work. Didn't work at all. Then I was treated as if I was a tourist, as if I didn't know anything, you know. Show me where the mosque is, you know, as though I didn't know what a mosque looked like, you know, that type of thing, rather than real serious questions about stuff. So I learned that, you know, when I did an interview, I had to let them know what level I knew. So I would ask loaded questions all the time. They were loaded specifically so that they would know that I knew certain things. And therefore, we would come into the dialogue at a certain level rather than a trivial level. And so that was methodological. And the archival research came later in my own work. I did do archival work at that time, but in what I was really interested in, which is once I had discovered that there were three groups of merchants, that's what I was interested in. It wasn't in the archives. You know, nobody noticed. Nobody cared. Nobody thought to ask. It was very bizarre. And two of the three groups were actually descended from slaves. And then they made a fortune in trade and invested in slavery in a big way. They owned plantations because they made money out of trade. So all of this is what I discovered. Not initially at all. I found stuff I could use, and I did subsequently use, and I went off in other directions, and then the archives became extremely important. But not when I was studying this initial topic of who these merchants were and how they made their money and how they built their networks and how they operate. And just to put it in context, I would say at about 1800, the origins of these three groups, they were all pretty poor. In the 19th century, they became the wealthiest merchants in this very large Muslim state because they concentrated on a particular niche in the economy and profited. And the interesting thing is they changed under the colonial period and continue to exist and continue in the colonial period. And then I could document this, although it wasn't in the archives. Well, they obviously were into transport. 1,500 donkeys traveling across West Africa in a caravan. That's called transport. Well, in the early colonial period, what do you think they went into in a big way? Transport. They were the first ones to buy trucks. Then they dominated the trucking industry. Then they dominated the gas stations because they branched out. They were no longer going in caravans of donkeys. And the most successful of these merchants who became, well, his name was Al-Hassan Dantata. He died in the 1950s. But his father was a caravan leader. His mother which was a bit unusual, quite unusual actually, had become a leading merchant in herself, in her own right, uh, in exile, because they had to go into exile in 1894, and she moved to Accra in Ghana and set up business there, and became very wealthy on her own right. Uh, After her husband had died, and her son, Alhassan Bantata, he went and first worked with mommy for a while, and then she kicked him out, and he went back to what's now northern Nigeria, to Kano, and became the biggest exporter of the cash crop from the region, using his commercial network to, in effect, become a big supplier for European firms who were buying peanuts, which was the cash crop that was grown during the colonial period in northern Nigeria. Groundnuts, as they called them in British English, but peanuts, that's what they were growing. Now, Alhassan Dantata went into transport. He became a produce buyer, and his son and his daughter today are the two wealthiest Nigerians. They're multi-billionaires. They own airlines. They own factories. They have their own museum in Kano. Great-great-grandparents were slaves. This is the family. So, so that actually what I stumbled across in my work had much bigger implications in terms of economic history, Nigerian history, and a whole bunch of things. Not that, I mean, I have a biography of this guy upstairs that was written by his son, and I've been to the museum, and I interviewed the guy's children, who are now, of course, they're as old as I am, of course. And the daughter is a bit unusual, just like the mother was, because usually women aren't as prominent. And she's bloody prominent. And she's got an extremely prominent husband as well. And no, she's a businesswoman. Let's not talk about gender inequality. No, this is class, not they know how to operate business. So the archives came in when I at a certain point in my young career, everything I had tried to study stuff that didn't have anything to do with slavery. I was studying trade. I was studying economy. I was studying. But here, many of the merchants were descended from slaves. What did they do with their profits but invest in slaves? Even though they were trading in other commodities, it didn't mean they didn't also trade occasionally in slaves. So everything, slavery was there, and I couldn't avoid it. Everything I was doing. Then I got interested in trying to find sectors of the economy where slavery wasn't important, which I did. But it was always now with comparison with what was going on in the slavery sector, as opposed to what was the interact. So the connections were there. So once I moved into slavery, then archives there's a lot. There's a lot. So that meant more and more archival work, more and more travel, more and more languages. Because the data is in so many different languages. And I've figured now I haven't checked this out recently, but at one point in time, I think I've done archival research in 14 countries. Yeah. So, I've done a lot. And that's what I'm doing now is I'm digitizing and organizing all of this stuff that I've collected over the last 50 some years. And it goes back to one of the original points I was making, which is originally was taught there wasn't much information. Oh yes, there is. There is a ton of documentation, and and we keep discovering and finding more and more information all the time. And I wouldn't even say that we're at anywhere near the end of discovery. It's that much. It's that rich. Well, the only other language where I've really done a lot of research in is French, but there's a lot in German, and there actually is a lot in Hausa and Arabic. I don't know Arabic script, so I don't work with anything that's really Arabic unless it's been put into Roman script or unless it's been translated. But increasingly, there's so much that has been translated and is translated. It turns out the political entity that I'm studying, where the merchants were the dominant merchants. The three founders of that state between 1804 and 1808 was a father and his brother and the son of the father. Those were the three. So they were, two brothers and a son nephew who ran it. Between the three of them, in Arabic, they wrote over 1,000 manuscripts, all of which have survived, all of which a lot of scholars are working on, looking at in Arabic. They also wrote in Fulfulde and Hausa a bit, but mostly Arabic, 99%. And actually, the daughter of that same father too also wrote a lot of poetry. Was very interested in women's education, elite women's education, but elite households. There would have been marginal discrimination within the household. Any woman in the house would have been educated in the same way everybody else was. It wouldn't have mattered whether she was a daughter or she was a slave woman. It wouldn't have mattered. They would have, as a household, would have, prayed together and were Muslims, and they would have shared the learning, and if any of the other women in the household, showed an aptitude for reading and writing, they wouldn't have been discouraged, just the opposite. But in doing research, I couldn't interview women. I didn't. There was only very few cases in my work where I was in a situation where I was interviewing a woman. I'm a man. You don't interview a woman. You interview her husband. You don't interview her. And in one situation, it was a very old woman who was, I was told, really knew everything. But she would only talk through her son. She wouldn't talk to me directly. It's a respect thing. It's not like a barrier or. I mean, it's easy to jump into ideology which says this is a certain type of exploitative relationship, but that's a little bit simplistic because it doesn't really take into account that it doesn't mean because she wouldn't talk to me directly that she didn't run the whole family. You don't know that. You don't know who's the boss. behind the scenes. If the woman turns out to be the one who really knows what's going on, how do you think the men in the household are going to stop her? You've got to be joking. It's either their sister or their mother. They're not going to. It's not. It's In fact, people would laugh. I mean, they would think you were funny that you didn't think. Oh, just because there's seclusion and the women can't do this and they don't do that and you don't see this, you don't think they know what's going on? You don't think they run things? That's really naive. So, so that was one. Otherwise, never. And of course, I'm not stupid. I pick up. I understand what the protocol is. I didn't even try because I realized that, to do that type of work, and there were people that doing that type of work, you had to be a woman. Then you could go in with the other women. In fact, you wouldn't even need an invitation. In somebody's house, you just follow the women and go wherever they go. While a man isn't going to go any further than the living room. He's not going to get out of the. So I obviously pick up on all of this protocol and customary, and you abide by it. Absolutely. You don't go and drink alcohol in front of Muslims. Unless you know them really well and it's a situation that has nothing to do with a cultural barrier. It depends what you're doing. It depends what you're doing. For me, the colonial officials really weren't interested in the backgrounds of the merchants. They were interested in the backgrounds of the aristocracy in the government. And they were very interested about collecting tax. So therefore assessing incomes and outputs and what's going on in the agricultural sector in particular. And they're interested in security, of course. So anything that was, and because of it's a crossover into Islam, the British knew a lot about Islam, and they were, because of occupation in India and the Middle East, and so on the one hand they collaborated and worked with Muslim leaders quite easily. On the other hand, they really tried to maintain and accept the distance of the cultural and religious distance. And in the Nigerian context, in the northern Nigerian context, where the dominant local political structure was based on a state that had been founded in the Holy War, the Muslim Holy War in 1804, 100 years before the British occupation. They easily defeated the at the time the governments and the armies that were in power in Africa, because there was an enormous technological disadvantage for African countries at that time because of the rapid development of firearms and machine guns and all kinds of stuff in Europe. It's a type of technological imbalance at the time, military imbalance, that made the conquest easy. So which is so shocking because today now any terrorist can get any kind of weapon and disrupt that thing in ways that just were not possible in 1900. There was no way that any of the African countries could get the types of weapons that they could need, that they could, you know, that a Ukraine could stop the Russia from a smaller country stopping a bigger country. How is this possible today? And in those days, it wasn't possible. It was simply not possible. So one of the features of British rule in this area is that all the British colonial officers had to be able to had to know Hausa. They had to know the language. They had to pass a Hausa certificate at Cambridge University, or they couldn't get employment in the colonial service in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, because the language of the administration was Hausa, because that was the dominant language. And obviously, every one of the British officers who spoke Hausa also had to have an interpreter, because you couldn't really trust your own Hausa. Well, come on. I mean, it's like a language. You can learn, but it doesn't necessarily mean you learn all the four-letter words, and you don't necessarily learn the inflection, and you don't necessarily get the nuances that you get with language when you're really fluent. And so, of course, but they had to be in Hausa. But they wrote all the reports in English. And of course, the reports, they don't talk about a whole bunch of things. They don't talk about women. I've only found two archival references to women. One where a high British officer said, "Oh, it's easy. We do the same thing we did in South Africa. We dress the women up so they look like men. Then they don't know that we got a woman." Oh, complete. Yeah, and then the other one was the first governor of northern Nigeria who took his wife to northern Nigeria. There was a comment by one of the junior officers saying, "Why did he bring his wife? She sits there with binoculars outside her tent and watches who goes in and out of..." Otherwise, complete silence. The French, they talked about it all the time. They were having liaisons all over the place and doing this, that, and having families. British, don't talk about this. And slavery was a bit like that in the British. I've got one marginal note written in pencil on a document that says, "Do not use the word slave. Call them serfs." Hide the truth. All that's methodology. Because when you see a big gap like that, then you can say, this isn't logical. Look, this isn't logical. This is an all-male administration coming out with unlimited power relative to anybody around them. They don't have any relationships with women. Doesn't make sense. But no proof, just complete. Great topic. If at this point, with the right student to study that, very hard. Very hard. You would have to. What a great topic. The code of silence. When it begins, how it's enforced, how it's Amazing. But that's the one thing about history. You see, there are so many good topics that aren't done, that are just, they're just ready for anybody who really want to. You would have to. Now it'd be getting more difficult to do what I'm talking about but it wouldn't have been like one of my former students who's helping here now, when he was doing his PhD work, maybe 20 years ago or more, it was still possible because he was still talking with some extremely senior British colonial officers who were still alive, about their memories and this, that, and the other. And he got quite close to a couple of them. He never did this, but I think he wouldn't, hey, well, it doesn't matter now. So times have changed and this, that. How did this work? I bet he could have got a couple of those guys to explain, well, I didn't do this, but this is what they were doing. Interesting. Which women, out of which families, with what implications? And you do this in a situation where you think the local power structure doesn't know what's going on. That's stupid. Because those local power structures to this day, they know everything that's going on. Yeah, that would be a fun topic. That would uncover a lot of embarrassment. The colonial officers at the time, this was maybe 1895 to 1920, they really thought of themselves as sort of the intellectual left. They're the ones that built the British Empire. They thought the types of things they were doing in Nigeria, for example, were even quasi-socialist. They had a whole these guys, they had to learn Hausa at Cambridge, and then they had to hang out around Cambridge. They had to have, they were right into contemporary thinking, let's put it that way, what was going on. And these were all people who thought, running an empire was cool. This is the way you change the world, because the British are the leaders in changing the world. And everyone accepted that. They put up with the likes of Cecil Rhodes and the guy who took northern Nigeria, Frederick Lugard. Frederick Lugard was a criminal, but he was a distinguished criminal, and he got away with things. And he was interested in power, and he was a governor in Uganda. He united Nigeria. He'd been a governor in Hong Kong. His wife, whose name was Flora Shaw, was a very famous British journalist and writer. She was handicapped, so she didn't always go with him on his trips, but she was a great defender and writer of a British Empire. And he was he took over northern Nigeria, which meant basically the Muslim state, the Sokoto Caliphate, and its surrounding populations, and turned it into his own little empire. And he had a big problem when he took over the Sokoto Caliphate, and the final conquest was in 1903. when he took over the Sokoto Caliphate. The Sokoto Caliphate had as many slaves as the United States did at the Civil War, like 4 million. Like, this is a huge slave population. So his his big thing was, how are we going to manage this so we don't have any, slavery problems? That was his big. And he followed the model that was first developed in India. See, the British emancipated slaves in 1834, but they only emancipated them in British colonies. What's the difference? A colony is a minor technical thing. Large parts of India, they weren't a colony. They were a protectorate. South Africa was a colony. Sierra Leone was a colony. Northern Nigeria was a protectorate. So no one was emancipated. Nobody. So instead, they created a legal fiction where they abolished, they no longer recognized slavery. That's what it was called. You couldn't go into a court and say, he's my slave. The judge would say, I don't care. I don't recognize that. If someone goes into court and says, he stole my daughter and sold her, the guy will go to jail. That's a criminal offense. You can't buy and sell somebody. But you can be a slave if you're not bought and sold. So it gets into murky legal da-da-da. That was it was one of the books that I've written with a colleague. The title of the book isn't called Slow Death for Slavery, because the way Lugard proposed to eliminate slavery was, he says, it'll take a generation. We'll say anybody born after March 30th, 1900, if you're born after that date, you're free. Born before that date, you're not. So it takes a whole generation before everybody being born is technically free. And the nice little phrase that they stuck in was, it's a slow death, but slavery will die. Just take a generation. Jeez, what a system. And then Lugard becomes the foremost British authority on slavery. This is our hero governor. He writes the entry in the first editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica on slavery. He becomes the British representative to the League of Nations on their special commission on slavery. He's a real authority. Real authority. And his successor was a guy by the name of Girard, who came from Quebec. So Canada is deeply involved in this whole charade that happened in northern Nigeria. Colonial service, ruling the world. Just astonishing. People don't know. In the 19th century, there were more slaves in the Muslim states in West Africa than there were in the Americas at any time, any point in history, in total. That's shocking. And people think it's a racial thing. They think it's this. It's much more complicated. Much more complicated.